My name is Zahra Dhoondia, and today is April 9th. The time is 3:10 p.m., and we are at the Pewaukee VFW. I'm interviewing Michael Malloy, who was born on December 7th, 1942, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He served in the Vietnam War from August 1968 to August 1969. Michael Malloy was a first lieutenant in the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division and served as an officer of psychological operations and civil affairs. This interview is sponsored by the Bell Tower Memorial. And just to start off, I was wondering, what did you do before you entered the service?
Before I entered the service, I had graduated from high school. I was going to Milwaukee Area Technical College, MATC, to get a 2-year associate degree, and I was working several different jobs. I had just graduated from MATC with my associate degree when I received a draft notice to come into the Army.
What was that process like of being drafted and kind of that basic training type of time?
When you're drafted and you report for military service, you end up going with and joining a group of people from all over the country into an Army Basic Training Center. There's a couple of them. And they put you in companies of about 200 folks in each company. Basic training is 2 months long, and it is designed to bring everybody into a common standard of being a basic soldier, Marine, airman, or seaman. Each branch of the service does it like that. Following basic training, everyone is sent to what's called advanced individual training. That's another 2 months, and that's where each, in my case, soldier, learns a specific Army skill. There are over 150 different jobs in the Army. And that's where the schools are that train us into one of those jobs. Following the completion of that school, we are sent to a military unit and to function in the job that we specialized in.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did upon being drafted and entering the Army.
And what was your involvement in this type of time of your life in the civil affairs and psychological operations?
After I got into the Army, went through basic and advanced individual training, they asked all of the people who were college graduates, and I had a 2-year college degree, to go into officer candidate schools and learn to be a lieutenant in that branch of service. And so I did that. That was a 6-month program. And we learned leadership, tactics, communications, coordination, and how to be a unit leader as a second lieutenant. After that, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry branch of the Army. I was sent to a unit at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. While I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, I found out about the Army Special Warfare School there, and it was another 3-month program to get involved with specialized training in some part of the special warfare. In my case, I went into civil affairs and psychological operations to work with the Vietnamese, to understand the Vietnamese, and to help the U.S. military work with the Vietnamese and accomplish the goals of both the U.S. military and the South Vietnamese government. And in that capacity, I did spend my entire year doing those types of things. In Vietnam, I was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division to the 2nd Brigade. There were 4 brigades in a division. Each brigade was authorized one officer to do this type of stuff. And so that's what I did. I was assigned 2 sergeants from the Vietnamese Army who functioned as my interpreters and my bodyguards when we spent our time in the villages.
When you were in Vietnam, where were you based?
I went to Vietnam from August of 1968 to August of 1969. In 1968, the 1st Cavalry Division was assigned to Quang Tri province of South Vietnam, and that is the northernmost province of South Vietnam along the border with North Vietnam. That's where I spent 1968 working in the villages and working with the Vietnamese militia, the Vietnamese Army, the Vietnamese government people, and the American advisors to them, as well as working with the 4 battalions of the 2nd Brigade.
Mm-hmm.
In 1969, the 1st Cavalry Division was totally relocated to 3 Corps, or northwest of Saigon, along the Cambodian border, and that's where I spent 1969, doing similar things, but in a different part of Vietnam.
And you mentioned that in your training you learned a little bit about that specialized warfare. When you were in Vietnam, what were your primary duties there, and how did that education and that training kind of prepare you for this time?
Our training involved Asiatic customs and cultures, understanding the people we were interacting with, understanding where they were coming from, what their thoughts were, and how we could work with them to accomplish our missions. And this was a big challenge. The interpreters helped me understand, not only work the language challenge, but they helped me understand the barriers of cultural differences and cultural thinking so that we could try to work together to accomplish common goals.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt very rewarding of being involved in getting to know the Vietnamese, live and work with the Vietnamese. I spent a lot of time in the villages, and this was all a different perspective than other military units that spent their time in the field, more involved with combat,
Mm-hmm.
and only involved with Vietnamese who were part of combat operations. I got involved with the whole culture at every level of the villages, the hamlets, the districts, their militias, their regular army, their government personnel, and the U.S. advisor teams that worked with each level.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me totally different perspectives in addition to the perspectives that I developed from living on a regular base with regular combat elements of the 1st Cav Division.
Mm-hmm. So when you were living with these Vietnamese civilians and kind of understanding their culture, how did you realize that it was a little bit different than your own culture back at home, and kind of how did you interact with them, especially since you didn't speak the same language?
It was a challenge. We came to Vietnam um, strictly trained as an army
Mm-hmm.
to do combat operations. And most of our thinking was to do it from a European perspective, because that's how we had been involved with World War I, World War II. Our experiences were how to conduct a regular open warfare conflict from the European perspectives. We were not good at understanding how to do this from an Asian culture
Mm-hmm.
perspective, and from a country that had been in war for nearly 20 years, just trying to be independent. Prior to the 10 years that the US military was involved, the French government and its army was involved. And in all of that period of time, the Vietnamese just wanted to be one unified country and not occupied by anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what was going on in the background, or that
Mm-hmm.
was the perspectives that I would get from spending time with the Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm. And when you were with the Vietnamese civilians, how did you kind of like work with them? I know like when we talked before, like you said that you would eat dinner with them, and you would make you like had different schools built and stuff like that. So would you be able to talk a little bit more about those kind of things that you did and what was your role there?
The villages were very primitive. I was mostly in hamlets and villages. Um, there is no electricity. There are no paved roads. There is no running water. There is no sanitation. This is just their way of life, very rural, very undeveloped. And so that's what I became part of when I spent time with them. There would be a fire at each house, or hooch, as sometimes they call them, and that would be to keep some water warm for tea and to cook up whatever meal they might have. The meals were frequently rice-based or noodle-based, with some broth and some vegetables and a small amount of meat.
And then could you talk a little bit about like the schools that you were like kind of like working with? Like I know like we mentioned before, or we talked before about like the hospitals that were built and things like that. So could you talk a little bit more about that
Yes,
possibly?
and we did not really have schools much in the villages, but more at the district level,
Okay.
which would have several villages.
Okay.
But each village would select one woman from their village to go up to the province level, which is equivalent to a state in the United States, and get a couple of months of training to be a village nurse or a village teacher. And they would be given just a small amount of supplies to bring back to that village to be that nurse for the village, or that teacher for the village. The teaching was done by what you would call rote, which is the teacher says things, the students repeat the things back. The teacher says things, the students repeat them back, and they try to memorize what they're learning. They do not have textbooks and workbooks that can be distributed to the students. The teacher has the only set of materials, that's all she's provided. One of the things that I would do is I would get a brick press. It's a wooden mechanism, and I would work with the folks to mix together mud and straw, a handful of cement and dirt with some water, press it into the size of a brick, then pop it out and let it air dry in the sun. And that would be one brick. And each day they could make as many bricks as they wish, and with that, they could build a one-room clinic or a one-room schoolhouse instead of everybody being out in the open or just trying to gather in a hut.
Mm-hmm. And for the different things that you did there, what do you consider your most important contribution during your service? And like you mentioned before, like your interaction with the Vietnamese civilians.
I brought a different image or interaction to the Vietnamese that I worked with, because their standard interaction was just with the average combat soldier, as combat groups would go on patrol around a village, through a village, and have combat operations. I would be there from a different perspective. I would be there to try to connect with them, to help them benefit from working with us, to try to convince them to work with us, and to listen to their concerns about what they needed. How could I help them? Keep in mind that there was no running water, no electricity, no paved roads, no conveniences. That meant no refrigeration, no fans, anything like that. One of the other features that I was able to do is get some hand pumps to put on top of the village well, so that with the hand pump, they could pump up some water, because I would get the hand pump mounted on top of the well on a wooden platform with pipes that would go down the well to the bottom of the well. Prior to that, they had to rely on dropping a bucket on a rope down the well to get some water. So, and another thing we did is little hand-operated rice threshing machines. Individuals would have rice paddies, rice fields, and they would harvest the rice by hand and work the rice by hand to get a quantity of rice for their needs. By getting some small hand-operated rice threshing machines, it made the work a little easier for them to accomplish their task from the rice paddies.
And could you talk a little bit about like the salation payments and things like that?
Sure. Salation payments are a project within the Army of where we try to compensate people for damage and accidents that were caused that were possibly the result, unintentional. They were unintentional. Excuse me. Sometimes when military convoys would go through a village, they would not slow down because they did not want to be ambushed. So if things got in their way, they just kept on going. Sometimes when we would fire artillery rounds as part of a combat operation, some of those rounds would not go exactly where they were meant to go, but they would fall short or overshoot the intended target, and they could land on a village. As a result, village livestock could be injured and killed, village people could be injured and killed. The salation payments was meant to provide some compensation for unintended consequences. And the pay chart, I would have a bag of money. The pay chart would indicate I would need to investigate whatever the incident was. And the pay chart was broken down to be, was this a male or a female animal? Was it a male or female person? Was it a middle-aged, productive animal or person? A very young person or animal, not yet productive? Or an elderly animal or person, no longer fully productive? Those considerations then would say, okay, based on that, here's how much the compensation will be. And here is your compensation to the family, and we're sorry for your loss. This was very difficult to put a money value on something that was very important to the family, whether it was their one water buffalo or one of the 6 family members. It's very difficult to say, okay, here's what it's worth as a couple of dollars. And separate from that, it all happened because of the hostilities going on, which made people very upset that because of our involvement in hospitalities, these things were happening. And to say, here's a couple of dollars, and we're sorry about that. Didn't really make them our friends, didn't really make them comfortable with what they now had to live with as an outcome of what happened. But that's what salation payments were.
Okay.
And it was just an Army program to deal with it.
And that was something that you kind of were in charge of, or how were
Yes,
you kind of
I
like?
had the money, I had the guidelines. It was part of my job under civil affairs to be the person that interacted with the Vietnamese.
Okay. And then under civil affairs as well, what was your involvement with like the Chu Hoi and protocol and the different types of propaganda that was also shared with the Vietnamese
The
civilians?
Chu Hoi program was meant to try to convince some of the enemy soldiers to stop fighting, and to accept what the South Vietnamese government wanted to accomplish. And so when we had combat situations, I would fly over the combat situations in a helicopter with my two interpreters. We would have speakers mounted on the bottom of the helicopter, and we would broadcast out a message in Vietnamese to try to convince some of the soldiers that if they just pretend you're wounded, lay down, pretend you're wounded, when the battle is over and the enemy unit leaves the field, stay on the ground, keep your hand off your weapon. When the American soldiers come through, put your hands up and say Chu Hoi, which means I surrender. We had a program for that called the Chu Hoi program. If anyone did surrender, then it would also be my job to go down with my interpreters and pick up those individuals. I also designed pamphlets, and we would have small planes. I would design a pamphlet. I would send that information to our division headquarters. They would quickly print off the pamphlets, load them in a small plane, and send them over the area where we were involved to drop those pamphlets. Again, the message was to try to convince people to stop fighting us.
And how did you see like the impact of these like pamphlets, the propaganda, and did the Vietnamese like government and that side also have these types of propaganda as well for the U.S.?
They had pamphlets. The North Vietnamese had pamphlets that they would distribute in the areas where the American units were to try to convince the American soldiers that if they stay, they're likely to just go home to their families as a body bag. And that the American soldiers should talk to their leaders about leaving South Vietnam and going home before the American soldiers end up dead. That was their goal. They would leave pamphlets like that, that this had been going on for a long time. We had lost many American soldiers, and to try to convince each soldier not to stay and continue to be part of that process.
Okay.
It was very similar to the pamphlets we would distribute to the North Vietnamese soldiers and the Viet Cong to convince them of almost the same messages. Many you've been involved in this for a long time. You've had many casualties. Please stop fighting this, and cooperate with the South Vietnamese government so that this can end.
And then in your total time there, what was the most important lesson that you learned and something that still sticks with you today?
I would think that from my perspective, what was very important is to develop a common word is empathy. Develop an understanding of other people. Develop an understanding of what are their concerns, what are their viewpoints, and try to come to some common ground with other people. And that means, in the empathy perspective, developing an understanding and appreciation of each other's different views and cultural differences, and find a way to get along without being at war. That has stuck with me for a long time, because the things that I mentioned before are frequently used under the term collateral damage. That's to avoid putting a name or a number on something. Collateral damage is the biggest source of casualties in every war. It means the civilians. It means the unintended consequences. It's not soldiers on either side. It's the people that suffer as a result of the soldiers doing what they do. And that's called collateral damage. To try not to put, the authorities don't want to put too much emphasis on collateral damage. But that is the biggest outcome of every war. And that bothers me because I became involved in that. I saw it.
And before we go into kind of what you've been doing now and after your time in the military, would you want to just show some of the pictures from your time there?
Sure. This is a picture of myself in Vietnam. in my tent. I was never on a base where I had a building, running water, flush toilets. I was always on smaller bases, living in tents. I did have a cot, but this is what I looked like in the field. Um, and this was my daily appearance in Vietnam. This is a picture of some of the Vietnamese interpreters who worked with us in Vietnam. The taller soldier there was my brigade commander. Um, he was the one that allowed me to develop initiatives, develop plans, and find ways to implement those initiatives working with the Vietnamese. So he authorized me to do that. He supported what I did. These are the Vietnamese Army sergeants that I worked with. This is a picture of refugees in Vietnam, people that had been displaced from their villages and had to relocate to an area that wasn't where the village would not be directly involved in combat all the time. We had to do that a lot. We would determine that some villages had too many people shooting at us, and we would go to the village and say, we need to relocate you to an area that we can provide better security and safety so that these things don't keep happening. So that was the type of program that I got involved with, everything connected with the Vietnamese. These are some of the Vietnamese militia people. In the villages, there was a militia called the PF, the Popular Forces. At the district level, it was called RF, Regional Forces. Above the district level is where the regular Army of Republic of Vietnam, regular Army soldiers operated. But down in the districts, it was the regional forces, and in the villages, it was the popular forces. So that was more the level of which I worked with folks.
And then to kind of transition to kind of what you did after military and your time in Vietnam, what was it? What was that transition like, and how were you received as a Vietnam veteran?
When I returned from Vietnam, we were encouraged not to wear a uniform, not to identify ourselves as Vietnam veterans, not to do that in any way. During this period of time, the Vietnam War was shown every night on the nightly news. This was the first war where everybody got to see what it's like to have a war going on. They see the casualties on the American side. They see soldiers being carried in their ponchos. They see the casualties of the Vietnamese, especially the civilians who are being hurt by the combat operations. The whole ugliness. This is a bad experience for everybody on both sides. So that whole ugliness came to everybody on their TV every night. First time that ever happened. It turned a lot of people off on having this kind of war go on and having the U.S. be part of it. As a separate piece of that, in order to maintain the number of people we needed in the military, we had a draft going on. I got drafted. And that meant that the military determined how many people they needed in each unit, in each branch of the service. And if enough people didn't volunteer in any given month, the balance of the need is drafted out of the community. And all men at age 18 were required to register and be available for the draft. So I got drafted. A lot of people turned against the war because they did not want their family members to be drafted and sent into the combat situation they saw every night on the news. Coming back home, the people turned against the soldiers. They did not really have an ability to turn against their government leaders. So they turned against the soldiers. We were the visible aspect of being in a war. Mm-hmm. And they were not kind to us. And that is why we didn't wear our uniforms. We did not promote awareness of ourselves, saying, I'm a returning veteran. I just went and did what I just served. I did my tour of duty. Now I'm back. That didn't work.
Mm-hmm. And following that time when you kind of like transitioned back to the U.S., what was your involvement in the reserves, and how did that kind of like transition, and how was your role in the Army Reserves as well?
When I came back from Vietnam, I was entitled to some GI military educational benefits. I already had a 2-year degree. When I came back from Vietnam, I went to the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh campus in central Wisconsin to get my 4-year degree. While I was there, I met many other veterans. Most of the veterans in that part of the state who were using their educational benefits to get a college degree were going to the Oshkosh campus as a 4-year campus. So I was able to decompress my concerns by being with hundreds of other veterans on campus instead of just coming back into the community of Milwaukee. Following my graduation from Oshkosh, I returned to Milwaukee and I joined the local Army Reserves and served in the local Army Reserve for 34 years. While I was at Oshkosh, as a student, I was also in the local battalion of the Army Reserves. And I simply transferred to a Milwaukee unit when I returned to Milwaukee after graduating from Oshkosh. That 34 years in the Army Reserves was unique. I found that maybe only 5% of the reserves had actually active duty experience. My experience was how do sergeants and officers function in active duty units. When the reserves, and I try not to put them down, but most of the reservists join the reserves to avoid being drafted or enlisting into the regular active army. So most of them went to basic training, they went to advanced individual training to learn a skill, then they returned to the reserve units. They never spent time in a regular active duty unit. They would go to the reserve meetings once a month. Each summer for 2 weeks, they go to a regular Army base to do active duty training. The whole purpose of the reserves was to be available for deployment if needed to supplement the regular active duty Army. But I did enjoy being part of that because I made a lot of good relationship friends in the reserves, especially among some of the people that I knew that had some active duty experience. We could connect well. For the others, it turned out that the 84th Division I was in, they wanted people with active duty experience to come into the reserve units and provide some perspective into the units of what it's like to need to be ready for active duty. And so I did that. And I stayed with them for 34 years. And I appreciated my time there. I still have many friendships and associations from the people I served with during my 34 years in the reserves.
Do you have any relationships or do you keep in touch with anybody from when you were in Vietnam, the other people serving or anything like that?
Unfortunately, I do not.
Okay.
I regret that. I regret when I left, I had only a 1-day notice saying, we all realized when we were getting, our typical tour of duty in Vietnam was 1 year at that time in the Army. And you knew you were getting close to your 1 year, but you didn't know exactly when you were going to get orders to leave. When the orders came in, it came on a very short notice, usually a 1-day notice. And all of a sudden I'd be told, you're leaving tomorrow. Turn everything in. Thanks for being part of our unit for a year, and you're out of here. From my unit with the 1st Cavalry Division, I went to a big base in Vietnam, a transport base, and got on a plane with others who were returning to the United States. And we spent that day flying home to the United States. When we got back to the United States, in my case, Oakland Army Air Terminal in California, we came off the plane. We were told we would be out processed that day and leave the next day. They said they would work with our papers overnight. We could go take the rest of the day off, catch a nap, go to the mess hall and get something to eat. The next morning we would report back. And on the next morning we would receive our final pay and our discharge papers. And that was the end of it. And we would get transportation to the nearest base, airport to get back to our home. And that was the end of out processing. Nothing else.
And when you were in Vietnam, this is a little bit back to what we were talking about before, but how did you communicate with like your family back at home, especially since you were drafted and all of a sudden you had to come back a year later?
My communications was mostly writing letters and getting letters back. We did not have electronics. This was in the mid-60s. There were no cell phones, no laptops. During my time there, I had one phone call home from my base in the field, and it was done in no time by a radio relay through a series of amateur radio operators. And so you would say something, and to indicate that you were done saying something, you would say over. That meant you were done saying something, and that would mean the person on the other end could now respond to you. And when they were done responding to you, they would say over, and it would come back to you to say something. It's radio communications.
Mhm.
I had one like that. And it relayed through several, and I found out later from my family, they could barely understand anything I
Oh.
said. Other than letters, the one other technique I had is I had a small battery-powered portable tape recorder. I could record messages on my tape recorder to my family or my friends back home that I was communicating with, and mail those small cassette tapes to them. They could listen to them, and then on their tape recorder at home, record messages back to me that I could listen to on my portable tape recorder. So those were the ways. One crummy phone call, some letters back and forth, and you didn't. And letter, it wasn't something you could just sit down every day. You didn't have time every day, but maybe once a week you might have time to sit down, because every day you were busy with your day's operations. Every night you were busy with briefings about how did the day go and what are we doing for tomorrow, and what do we need to be ready for tomorrow. That was your typical full day.
Mhm.
We didn't. It's 7 days a week, so it's not like, oh, I've got Saturday and Sunday off. It's the weekend.
Mhm.
War doesn't operate like that.
Mhm. And then kind of back to your time in the reserves, can you briefly talk about your time as a battalion operations officer and a warrant officer?
Sure. Um, in the reserves, I worked my way up through different assignments, like a company commander, a battalion supply officer S4, things like that. Eventually, as a senior captain, I got selected to be the battalion operations officer. The battalion operations officer works directly with the commander of the battalion to plan training and activities. And that's very key. I enjoyed being part of that process of being able to work with a commander and say, what do we need to do with each of our meetings, with each of our different groups of people to help them be good at their jobs and to be ready to do their jobs and to fill the scheduled hours of a meeting.
Mhm.
I think I got selected for that because I had active duty experience
Mhm.
at planning things and coming up with ways to accomplish plans. And I felt good because when all the other positions in the battalion, they don't get involved with planning what the battalion's going to do. They just say, yes, sir,
Mhm.
because the battalion commander says, this is what we're doing. And everybody else says, yes, sir. But being able to sit down with the battalion commander and develop those plans on how to accomplish our missions, I enjoyed being part of that.
Mhm. And then lastly, I understand that you work with homeless veterans. So, what is a piece of advice that you have for other veterans or other people currently serving?
I do work with homeless veterans and, in a broader category, veterans who are considered at risk of not being able to manage themselves well.
Mhm.
And I work throughout the year on that. I work with a program called the Stand Down. We do this in Milwaukee every spring and fall. We average about 120 veterans at each one are homeless or at risk. The Stand Down is a military term. A unit in the field gets to stand down periodically and come in out of the field to spend a couple days on a base. So our perspective on the stand downs is to get the homeless and at-risk veterans off the streets for a day and to connect them with supportive services. That's what a military unit does when it gets a stand down from the field. So we are trying to connect them with supportive services. When we do this, we set up over 2 dozen supportive service resource tables and services for them. We get them haircuts, we give them meals, we provide clothing, but we try to connect them with all kinds of resources. As I mentioned a little earlier, war is a crummy experience. Not everybody becomes part of war. Not everybody who serves in the military, they're all veterans. Everybody who serves is a veteran. Not every veteran becomes part of combat operations um, and comes back with the issues of being part of that crummy experience. Um, Too many veterans, when they come back, don't know how to deal with all those issues. And
Mhm.
some of them start to self medicate or internalize. Neither one of those are good ways to deal with what's bothering you.
Mhm.
And that's why we try to connect them with resources um, to help them through their issues, to help them so they're not just internalizing or self medicating.
Mhm. I think that's really amazing that you can consistently are being involved with other veterans and things like that. And in closing, this has been an interview of Michael Malloy regarding his service during the Vietnam War. My name is Zahra Dhoondia, and the time is
Do
3:45.
we have time for one more quick thing?
Sure.
All right, one other thing I'd like to end up with is that because I'm in about half a dozen different veterans organizations, and I'm also involved with over half a dozen community organizations as a veteran.
Mm-hmm.
Once a year, Milwaukee County selects a Veteran of the Year, and they have to be involved as much with the community as a veteran as they are with other veterans. The rating, it's a balanced approach. So one year I was selected as the Milwaukee County Veteran of the Year. There's one person each year. We have many veterans who do stuff to help other veterans. The harder aspect is to find veterans who get involved in the community. One reason I was able to do that is I used my skill sets that I developed on how to get involved, be involved, identify things that need to be taken care of or worked on, and then get involved with helping to make those things happen. And so that's what this was.
Okay. So now, in closing, this has been an interview of Michael Malloy regarding his service during the Vietnam War. My name is Zahra Dhoondia, and the time is 3:46. And as always, thank you so much for your service.
Thank you. Thank you for getting involved with understanding and appreciate veterans and presenting that story.
Thank you.